Texas Hill Country, 1879. The sky had turned the color of ash over the town of Harper when the widow stepped onto the porch of the general store, her skirts torn at the hem, her eyes steady despite the whispering behind her. "She is too poor to be chosen," someone muttered loud enough for her to hear. Tahlia Anderson knew they were right. She had nothing. No husband, no family, no land. Just a patched shawl and 2 hungry mouths to feed. Her twin children, Ada and Amos, clung to her hands, thin, quiet, and old in the eyes for being only 6. The townsfolk of Harper had never taken to her. She arrived 2 years ago, dragging a wagon with a dying man, her husband, and 2 babies. He passed before the first frost. Since then, folks avoided her like bad luck might rub off just by standing too close. She kept her head down, clutching a small sack of flour she could barely afford. The coins she'd earned mending shirts for a ranch hand jingled in her pocket, barely enough for tonight's supper. She turned away from the store, trying not to notice her children's bare feet or the way folks took a step back as she passed. Then came the voice. "You dropping that sack? Or you planning on carrying it all the way to your shack by sheer will?" She turned, startled. A tall man leaned against a post, his arms crossed, a dusty hat low over his brow. He looked like he belonged to the land's sun-darkened skin, lean frame, boots worn to the bone. His horse waited behind him, tied to a rail, calm as water. "Excuse me?" Tahlia asked. He stepped forward, lifting the sack from her arms like it weighed nothing. "I said, I'll walk you home. Or at least carry this so your arms do not fall off." She stared at him. No one had offered her help in over a year. "Why would you do that?" He shrugged. "Because I have arms. And you look like you could use a break. Name's Vaughn Reddick. I have a ranch west of here." "You?" She hesitated. "Tahlia Anderson." He nodded once, like he already knew her name. Then he looked down at the children. "And these 2. Tahlia stiffened. "They're mine. Ada and Amos. Their father is gone." "I figured." He looked her in the eye, not with pity. "Just steady. Let me walk you home." She wanted to refuse. Pride had gotten her through worse. But her arms ached, and Amos had started coughing again the night before. "Fine," she said. They walked in silence along the dirt path beyond town. The children dragged behind, tired. Vaughn offered to carry Ada, and when Tahlia started to protest, he said, "She is light as a feather. I do not mind." Ada curled into his shoulder without a sound, like she had done it 100 times. Tahlia watched him carefully. He did not ask questions, did not tiptoe around her poverty, just walked beside her, carrying half her burden like it was natural. Her cabin came into view, 1 room, with slats, a leaning chimney. Vaughn set down the flour on the porch. "How long have you been out here?" he asked. 2 years. "You built this." "My husband started it before he died. I finished it. Took a while." He looked out at the land surrounding her home, wild, dry, but honest. "You do not have a man helping you with the cattle?" "Chickens." She laughed, bitter. "We do not have cattle. Just 2 hens and a goat that barely gives milk. People do not come out here unless they want something they will not admit." Vaughn's jaw tightened a little. "That's so." Tahlia nodded. "You have what you came for. I only came to carry your sack." That silenced her. She stared at him, unsure what to make of a man who gave without asking. He tipped his hat. "I will be back tomorrow." "For what?" "To fix that fence before your goat wanders into a coyote's mouth." "I did not ask you to. You do not have to." And just like that, he walked off. The next day, he came back, with nails, planks, and a quiet way of working. The twins watched him from the doorway while Tahlia stood inside, arms crossed. He worked fast, hands sure. When he finished, he nodded once and left again. He came the day after that, fixed the leaky roof, then the stove, then brought 2 chickens of his own because hers had gone missing. Tahlia tried not to soften to him, but Vaughn was not like other men. He never looked at her like she was a burden. He never looked at her like he pitied her. "You do not have to keep coming," she said one evening, standing at the door with her arms folded. "I know," he said. She stared at him. "Then why do you?" He stepped closer, his voice low. "Because you were worth coming for." Her breath caught. The wind moved through the trees behind them, but she did not move. Not when he reached up and tucked a stray strand of her hair behind her ear. Not when he said, "Let me court you, Tahlia. Proper. I have land, a home, and a heart that has had its eye on you since the first time I saw you walk into town with your head high and your babies close." She swallowed, unsure if she had heard him right. "You want to marry me?" "I want to love you," he said. if you will let me. Tahlia looked down at her hands. Calloused. Worn. She had not been touched tenderly in years. I cannot offer you much, she whispered. You offered life to 2 children and kept them alive when no one helped you. That is more than enough. Tahlia looked at him, really looked. He had not flinched at the way her dress was patched, had not minded her children, had not once tried to shame her. He just stood there, honest and quiet, offering something real. She stepped forward and placed her hand on his chest. His heart beat strong beneath her palm. I will not run, she said. Good, he said, and leaned down to kiss her forehead, slow and warm. The children peeked through the window, Ada whispering to Amos, he likes Mama. Tahlia heard it and smiled into Vaughn's chest. For the first time in years, she felt chosen. Not out of pity, but love, real and growing. 2 days after Vaughn's quiet proposal, Tahlia stood at the edge of the garden bed, pulling weeds from between struggling stalks of corn. The earth was dry, stubborn, and the sun had barely begun to rise, but sweat already gathered at her temple. She paused when she heard hoofbeats approaching, not hurried, not loud, just steady. Vaughn dismounted without a word and tied his horse to the split rail post. He carried a canvas sack over one shoulder and a small wooden box in the other hand. I brought seed potatoes and a whetstone, he said, setting them down without waiting to be invited. You'll need both if you're planning to keep feeding 3 mouths come winter. Tahlia wiped her brow with the back of her wrist. I wasn't expecting you before noon. You weren't expecting me at all the first time. She didn't argue. Instead, she knelt again and resumed pulling weeds from around the base of a sagging stalk. Vaughn crouched beside her and took to the task without asking. After a long, quiet stretch, she asked, why do you never talk about your family? He kept his eyes on the soil. Because there's not much to say. My father drank himself into ruin, and my mother left what was left of us before I could read. I worked cattle for other men until I could buy land of my own. She glanced at him. You did that alone? I did. They worked until the sun sat higher, warming their backs. The children came out barefoot, holding tin cups, and Tahlia sent them down to the creek for water. When they were out of earshot, Vaughn leaned back on his heels. I saw the preacher in town yesterday, he said. He told me you never came when your husband passed. There was no service. I buried him myself. The town had no room for a woman with no name they respected. He nodded like that made sense to him. I've got a neighbor, Mrs. Hallie. Widow, no children. Keeps bees and minds her own affairs. Would you trust her to mind the twins if you came with me to town tomorrow? Tahlia narrowed her eyes. Why would I come to town? We'll need to get the license. I reckon you'd want to stand in front of a preacher properly this time. She let the trowel fall into the dirt. You were serious? I've never said a thing I didn't mean. Her throat tightened. You still want to marry me, even knowing I've got nothing but 2 mouths to feed in a house that leans when the wind comes too hard? I want a woman who doesn't break when the world turns cruel. I want children who've known love even when there wasn't much else to go around. That's what I want. Tahlia stood slowly, brushing soil from her skirt. And if I say yes? Then I'll come for you at first light. We'll ride in together. She didn't answer. Not right away. Instead, she walked to the edge of the yard, where the goat lay in the shade, chewing lazily. She looked back at him, standing there in his dust-covered coat, the same as he was the first time he stepped into her life unasked for, but steady. I'll ask Mrs. Hallie myself, she said. He smiled not wide, just enough for his eyes to crease. I'll be here at dawn. As the day wore into afternoon, Tahlia mended a tear in Amos's shirt while Ada picked wildflowers nearby. The wind carried the scent of creosote and dry grass, and for the first time in a long while, the silence around their cabin didn't feel like loneliness. It felt like waiting, like something was unfolding, quiet and sure. That night, she braided Ada's hair by firelight and told Amos not to stay up reading by moon again. She kissed their foreheads and stepped outside once they were asleep. The moonlight stretched silver over the yard. She sat on the porch, listening to the night sounds, the scrape of cicadas, the rustle of dry leaves. Her hands rested in her lap, palms rough from work. She thought of the way Vaughn had looked at her that morning, not with hope, but with certainty. She had not been chosen before, not by the town, not by life. But now, a man with calloused hands and a quiet voice was offering her something she had not dared imagine, a future that did not require her to survive alone. She stayed on the porch until the fire burned low inside, until the stars overhead blinked steady and bright. And when she finally rose and stepped back into the house, she did so with a decision already settled in her chest like seed planted in good soil. The morning broke pale and quiet, a thin mist curling along the creek bed as Vaughn rode up the path. His horse's hooves left soft impressions in the damp earth. He carried no saddlebag, just a rolled coat strapped behind the cantle and a rifle slung low. The quiet of the land made every sound sharper: the creak of leather, the breath of the mare, the rustle of a jay in the juniper trees. Tahlia stepped off the porch before he reached the gate. Her hair was braided back, pinned neatly beneath a faded bonnet she hadn't worn since her arrival in Harper. The twins stood behind her, Ada holding Mrs. Hallie's hand, Amos clutching a worn book. The older woman stooped but sharp-eyed nodded toward Vaughn without waiting for any thanks. "You'll be back by sundown," Mrs. Hallie said to Tahlia. "I'll see that they're fed and not too wild by then." Tahlia brushed her fingers across Ada's cheek and pulled Amos in for a quick, firm embrace. Neither child cried. They only watched her with wide, unreadable eyes as Vaughn helped her mount his mare, gathering the reins with a practiced hand. The ride to Harper passed in silence. The fields along the road bore the signs of a dry spring: short grass, cracked creeks, but the sky stayed soft with the promise of rain. Vaughn kept his horse at a careful gait, aware of the way she sat behind him, her hands loosely clasped at his waist but not holding on too tight. They reached town as the sun slipped above the ridge. A few wagons clattered over the road, and the blacksmith's hammer rang out against iron. Eyes turned their way, some narrowed, some surprised. No one spoke. Talia's heartbeat did not quicken. She kept her chin level, her hands still. Vaughn dismounted first, then reached up to help her down. When she stepped onto the dusty street, her boots left clear prints beside his. They walked together across the square past the mercantile, where Mrs. Weller stared through the window without blinking, past the livery, where a stable boy paused with a bridle in hand. At the preacher's house, Vaughn knocked once. The door opened to a man with white whiskers and a wool vest too thick for the season. His expression shifted when he saw Tahlia, but Vaughn didn't give him time to speak. "We're here to be married," he said. The preacher hesitated, then stepped aside. "Come in." The parlor smelled of dust and lavender. A Bible lay open on a small table, and a single chair was drawn up beside it. The ceremony passed without ornament. No hymns, no ribbons, just the preacher's voice, steady but clipped, and the soft rasp of their "I do, s." Vaughn's hand found hers when it was done, his grip warm and sure. He didn't kiss her there, not under the preacher's eye, but she didn't need him to. When they stepped back onto the street, the sky had darkened. Thunder rolled faintly in the west. Tahlia glanced toward the store, where a cluster of women had gathered under the awning, whispering behind their hands. One of them, Mrs. Fay, who had once refused Talia's stitching because dust carried, looked away when their eyes met. Tahlia didn't. She turned to Vaughn. "I want to stop by the post before we ride out." His brow lifted slightly. "You expecting a letter?" "No, but it's time they see me walk into that place with my head up." He waited beside her as she stepped inside. The postmaster blinked in surprise, but handed over the empty box without comment. She thanked him, then turned and walked out, her back straight, her steps even. Outside, Vaughn handed her the reins. "You want to ride up front?" She shook her head. "I'll stay behind you." As they rode out of town, the wind picked up. The rain didn't fall, but the smell of it lingered sharp and clean. The dust softened under the hooves of the mare, and the clouds moved slow over the hills. When they reached her cabin, the children were waiting under the porch eaves. Mrs. Hallie had already gone, a basket of eggs left beside the door. Ada ran into her skirts. Amos reached for Vaughn's hand. That evening, after the children were asleep, Tahlia stood at the window, watching the shadows stretch long over the field. Vaughn came up behind her, not touching, just present. "You ever see yourself staying on that land of yours," she said, "with someone like me?" "I saw it before you did," he said. She turned slowly. "I don't know how to be someone's wife again," she said. "Not the way folks around here expect." "I don't want you to be anything but what you've already been," he said. Strong. Honest. Still standing. She stepped into his arms, and this time, there was no hesitation. When he kissed her, it was quiet and certain, like everything else about him. Outside, the wind stirred the trees. The house held still. And for the first time since she'd buried her past, Tahlia felt something settle inside her that had long been missing. Home. By late summer, the dirt behind Talia's cabin had begun to hold rows of green. The seed potatoes Vaughn brought had taken root, and the corn stalks, though short, stood straighter than before. The goats still wandered, but now it stayed close to the new fence Vaughn had built with Ada's help. He had moved in slowly, not all at once, not with grand pronouncement. First, it was his tools by the door. Then, a spare shirt hung on the wall peg. By the time the nights cooled and the wind carried the first scent of fall, he was sleeping beneath the roof he helped mend, waking before the sun to chop wood and wash at the basin beside her. One evening, she found him at the table, bent over a folded map. His fingers traced a thin blue line running west of Harper. "You thinking of leaving?" she asked. He shook his head. "No. Thinking of expanding. There's a gully out past Dead Man's Ridge. If we divert the runoff, we could bring water down to the edge of the garden come spring." She leaned against the doorframe. "You'd have to ask the Elwoods. That land was theirs last I heard." "I already did." She raised an eyebrow. "They said no," he added, sitting back. "But I think they'll change their minds if we offer to patch their south fence. It's falling in like wet paper." Tahlia crossed the room and rested her hand lightly on the back of his chair. "You always plan 5 steps ahead." "Only when I've got something worth planning for." She didn't answer that, only reached into the cupboard for the jar of beans they'd shelled that morning. When she turned back, he was watching her not with hunger or pride or even gratitude, just a quiet ease that settled deep in her chest. Later that week, she walked into town alone for the first time since the wedding. The twins stayed with Vaughn, who'd promised to show Amos how to read cattle brands and let Ada crack corn for the hens. She wore her second-best dress, the one with the blue stitching at the cuff, and stepped into the mercantile with her head high. Mrs. Weller paused mid-transaction when she saw her. The whole store grew still. Tahlia set a list on the counter. "I'll need flour, lye soap, a spool of black thread, and the tin basin I ordered last week." The older woman didn't speak for a long moment. Then she cleared her throat and turned to gather the items. Tahlia waited, steady. When the goods were packed, she laid down the silver coins Vaughn had left her that morning. "You'll be back for the basin?" Mrs. Weller asked, voice clipped but not cold. "It's for laundry. I'll take it now." As she left, she passed a boy sweeping the boardwalk. He looked up and tipped his cap, no hesitation, no whispering. The air outside smelled of dust and cedar. She hitched the wagon herself, climbed aboard, and drove home with the basin rattling behind her. That night, after the children were asleep and the fire burned low, Vaughn pulled a small parcel from beneath the bed. He set it in her lap without a word. Inside was a length of red calico, the fabric fine and soft. "I can't wear this to town," she said, running her fingers across it. "It's not for town," he said. "It's for you. For sitting on the porch. For Sundays. For when we don't owe anyone anything." She folded the cloth carefully, pressing it flat against her knees. "I used to sew for other women. Try to copy the patterns in the magazines they brought back from Austin." Her voice caught. "I never kept any of it. Never had reason to." "You do now." She looked up, her eyes catching his in the firelight. "I never thought I'd have peace," she said softly. "You don't have to think it," he said. "You just have to keep living it." He reached across and took her hand, no urgency, no weight. Just the simple closeness of skin to skin, the quiet understanding that nothing more had to be said. Not tonight. Outside, the trees rustled under the first chill wind of the season. Inside, the room held steady. By early October, the mornings came cold enough to frost the edges of the cabin window glass. Vaughn rose before first light, stepping quietly over the creaking floorboards to tend the fire before the children stirred. Tahlia followed after, dragging a shawl over her shoulders, her feet bare against the chilled floor. She found him on the porch, his coat unbuttoned, breath curling in the air. He didn't look back. "There's a wagon coming from Stonewall today. Fence wire, nails, and a new plowshare. I was thinking of taking Amos with me. He's old enough to start learning." She drew the shawl tighter. "He'll like that. He's been asking questions about the ox yoke in the shed." Vaughn nodded, still watching the sky. "I'll be careful with him." She stepped closer, her voice low. "You always are." By the time the sun rose full, Vaughn and Amos had headed out, leaving Ada behind with Tahlia. The girl spent the morning grinding cornmeal while her mother stitched a lining into their winter coats. Talia's fingers worked quickly, the needle pulling thread through thick wool with even rhythm. Ada sat nearby, humming under her breath. Around mid-afternoon, a knock sounded at the door. Tahlia brushed her hands clean and opened it to find Mrs. Hallie standing there, cheeks wind-reddened, holding a square of folded muslin. "I thought you might want these," she said. "Winter's close, and I've more beeswax than I need. Candles won't make themselves. Tahlia accepted the cloth-wrapped bundle. Thank you. Mrs. Hallie hesitated on the step. I heard about the Elwood water line. You did well. Tahlia blinked. That wasn't me. Vaughn handled it. He made the offer, but you're the reason they trusted it. Don't think folks haven't noticed the change in this place. Tahlia folded the cloth tighter in her hands. I just do what needs doing. That's what I mean. The older woman gave a short nod. You've done well. After she left, Tahlia set the bundle on the table and returned to sewing. The house was quiet, save for the clack of Ada's spoon against the bowl. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the shutters. She glanced toward the trail Vaughn had taken, wondering how far they'd gotten. Evening settled slow, the kind that stretched the sky into deep amber before it slipped into dusk. When Vaughn finally rode up with Amos beside him, both were dust-covered, tired, and laughing low between themselves. Tahlia stepped onto the porch before they dismounted. He kept asking about the wheel rim, Vaughn said, lifting the boy down. Wanted to know why it squeaked. Thought we'd lose the axle every time we hit a rut. Amos grinned. It didn't, though. Vaughn ruffled his hair. Not this time. Later that night, after the children had gone to bed, Tahlia sat beside Vaughn at the hearth, a pot of beans warming on the coals. He reached forward and stirred it once, then leaned back against the leg of the daybed. I saw the sheriff today, he said. He asked if I consider taking a deputy post come spring. Said they'd need someone steady if the rail spur goes through. She folded her hands in her lap. Would you take it? Only if it keeps me here. I'm not going chasing bounties or riding out for weeks. I told him that plain. And he said he'd think on it. I reckon I would too. Everything I need's here. She looked into the fire. I can't promise it'll always be easy. I'm not after easy. He reached for her hand, his palm rough and warm. I'm after you. She didn't speak, only leaned into his shoulder, her breath steady. They sat that way until the fire burned low, until the last ember pulsed and faded. By the time winter settled in earnest, the cabin felt different. Not just fuller, but rooted. The garden had been harvested, the shelves lined with jars. Vaughn had built a second table, smaller, to hold the children's books and slates. Ada had started copying letters. Amos carved odd shapes from wood scraps, leaving shavings in corners. Tahlia didn't mind. One morning, snow came sudden and heavy, covering the yard in slow silence. Vaughn pulled her outside by the hand, and they stood together in the hush, boots sinking into the white. He turned to her, brushing snow from her sleeve. Do you ever miss what came before? He asked. She looked toward the hills. Sometimes, but I don't want it back. He nodded once. Me neither. She reached up, touched his cheek with her gloved hand. You made room for us. I didn't have to. You fit here. He bent then, kissed her gently. No rush. No need. When spring came, the creek behind the house rose, and the first shoots pushed up from the thawed ground. The bee-box misses. Hallie helped them build filled with sound, and the goat birthed twins that Ada named without asking anyone's opinion. Vaughn took the deputy post, but only part-time. He rode into town twice a week, always back before sundown. Tahlia taught the children from the books Vaughn found in Fredericksburg, and in the evenings, they sat on the porch together, watching the sky change. Years passed, quiet and full. The land held strong, the cabin firm against every season. Hands grew older, lines settled into faces, but the love between them never bent. Vaughn built her a bench beneath the cottonwood tree. She brought him coffee there each morning, even when her knees ached and the children were too grown to need minding. They didn't speak of the past much. There was no need. Everything they had now had been shaped from it, weathered and made whole. They were never alone again.